Hey, welcome back, friend. I'm so glad you're here tonight. Pull up something comfortable, maybe a blanket, maybe a warm drink, because tonight we're going somewhere most history books completely skip over. Not to a battlefield, not to a palace, not to some king's grand dining hall lit up with 1,000 candles. We're going home, a regular ordinary home, somewhere in the 1700s. The kind of place where the floor might be bare dirt, where the walls let in a little wind, and where 6 or 7 people share a space not much bigger than your living room. And here's the thing that will genuinely surprise you the moment you're about to witness inside that home is not dinner. It is not bedtime. It is not a cozy family gathering by the fire. It is sunset. And in the 1700s, sunset was not peaceful. It was not romantic. For the average family, the last hour of daylight was the most stressful 60 minutes of the entire day, a race against darkness that if you lost could cost you everything. Stay with me tonight, because by the end of this story, you will never look at a simple sunset the same way again. Before we dive in, I just want to say, if this kind of storytelling speaks to you, if you find yourself settling in and feeling that quiet pull of history, it would mean the world to me if you hit that subscribe button and give this video a like. You do not have to do it right now. Do it when you feel it, when something I say makes you think or smile or feel something real. And if you want to share where you're watching from tonight, whether it is your bedroom, your couch, or some corner of the world I have never heard of, drop it in the comments. I genuinely love reading those. Now, dim the lights a little if you can. Let the fan run soft in the background, and let us go back all the way back to an evening in the year 1740, somewhere in rural colonial America. Picture a family, a husband and wife, maybe 4 children ranging from age 3 to 14. They live on a small farm, probably somewhere in Pennsylvania or Virginia. Their house has one main room, one with a loft overhead, where the older children sleep, and a small lean-to attached to the back used for storage, and occasionally for sheltering a sick animal during winter. The house is perhaps 20 feet wide and 16 feet deep. That is it. That is the whole world for this family of 6. And right now the sun is beginning to set. You might imagine this as a beautiful moment. The golden light spilling across the fields, the day winding gently to a close. But inside that small farmhouse, the mother is not watching the sunset. She is counting it. Because the moment that sun dips below the horizon, the clock resets, and not in a good way. Here is something historians have documented carefully about life in colonial America, and across rural Europe in the 18th century, the workday officially ran from what they called first light to dark. In Virginia, this was not just a custom, it was law. Authorities had transplanted an Old English statute called the Statute of Artificers, which required all able-bodied people outside the gentry class to engage in productive work from sunrise to sunset. The day was literally measured by light, and when the light ended, everything had to be finished. Or else. So what did "or else" actually mean? Let us walk through the last hour of daylight together, because what this family had to accomplish before the sky went dark is frankly exhausting just to read about. The first thing that had to happen, and this was non-negotiable, was the livestock. In the 1700s, the average small farm kept a combination of animals, at minimum a few chickens, probably a pig or 2, possibly a cow, and if the family was doing reasonably well, a horse or an ox. These were not pets. They were the entire economic engine of the household. The cow produced milk that would become butter or cheese. The chickens produced eggs. The pig would eventually become the salt pork that fed the family through winter. The horse or ox made the field work possible, and every single one of those animals had to be secured before nightfall. Why? Because the 1700s countryside was not the gentle pastoral landscape we imagine today. Foxes, wolves, and coyotes, depending on where you lived, actively hunted at night. A chicken left unsecured in an open yard overnight was a dead chicken by morning. A pig that wandered away from a loosely latched pen could disappear entirely. Even in colonial New England, wolf attacks on livestock were documented well into the mid-1700s. So in that last golden hour the children were running. The oldest boy was herding the chickens into the henhouse, counting them, because losing even one hen was a real financial blow to a family operating at the edge of subsistence. The younger children were filling the water troughs for the morning, because you do not want to discover at 5 in the morning that the cow has no water and you have to trek to the well before you can do anything else. The husband, if he'd been working the fields all day, was doing the final walk around the fence line, checking for breaks or loose posts, because a fence that looked fine at noon could fail overnight, and a cow or pig that got out in the dark might not be found for days. Fences in the 1700s were not decorative. They were survival infrastructure. All of this had to happen before the light was gone, and the light did not wait. Now here is something I want you to really sit with for a moment. We use the phrase "beat the clock" casually today. You're running late for a meeting, you're trying to finish something before a deadline. It is stressful, sure, but the consequences are usually manageable. In the 1700s, the clock they were beating was the sun itself, and the consequences of losing that race were not a missed meeting or a stern email from your boss. They were darkness. Real, complete, total darkness. We genuinely cannot comprehend this today. Even in the most rural parts of modern America, there is ambient light. Street lights miles away. The glow of a neighboring town. Your phone screen. Something. In rural colonial America, when the sun went down and the fire inside the house was the only light source you had, and you had to be careful about how much of it you used, the darkness outside was absolute. Walking to the barn in the middle of the night to check on a sick animal meant walking in complete blackness, carrying a small lantern that could be snuffed out by wind navigating familiar ground that suddenly felt completely foreign. This is why the last hour of daylight was so precious. Every task completed before dark was a task you did not have to attempt in the dark. And attempting things in the dark in the 1700s was not just inconvenient, it was genuinely dangerous, but the livestock was only part of the equation. Let us step inside the house for a moment, because the mother had her own race against sundown happening simultaneously. The fire. In the next part of our series, we will spend a great deal of time with the hearth. It deserves its own full story. But for now, understand this. In the 1700s, a fire was not something you started easily. There were no matches. Not until the 1820s would the friction match be invented, and even then it would take decades to reach ordinary households. In the 1700s, you used flint and steel to start a fire, striking them together to produce a spark, trying to catch that spark in a small bundle of dry tinder, then carefully transferring that tiny flame to your kindling and then to your wood. On a good day in good conditions with dry materials and a skilled hand, this might take 5 to 10 minutes. On a bad day, when the tinder is slightly damp, when the wind is coming in the wrong direction, when your hands are cold and stiff from a full day of work, it could take much longer. This is why the cardinal rule of colonial homemaking was simple: never let the fire go out. The fire in the hearth was not just for cooking. It was the only source of heat in the house, and in a region that could see frost well into April heat was not optional. It was the only reliable source of light once the sun went down. It was the means by which the next morning's breakfast would be prepared, because colonial women often started the porridge or the cornmeal mush the night before, letting it simmer slowly on low coals through the night so it would be ready at first light. So in that last hour before dark, while the children were securing the animals, the mother was tending to the fire, building it up enough to last the evening, measuring the wood. Because this is another thing modern people genuinely do not think about: wood was not unlimited. One historical journal from the 1760s documented by researchers at Colonial Williamsburg recorded that a family with 7 fireplaces in their home burned 44 cords of wood in a single year. 1 cord of wood is a stack 4 feet high, 4 feet wide, and 8 feet long. 44 of those. For a larger house with multiple fireplaces, for a small single-room farmhouse with 1 hearth, a winter might require 12 to 20 cords depending on how cold and long the season was. And all of that wood had to be cut, split, dried, and stacked by hand before winter arrived. Every stick of wood placed on the fire in October was a stick of wood that someone had carried and chopped in August. Waste was not an option. So the mother was not just tending the fire. She was making calculated decisions. How much wood for tonight? How long will the coals last? What can I cook tonight that will stretch into tomorrow? The mental arithmetic of running a household with no safety net was constant, exhausting, and invisible, because this is what was expected of her, and no one called it impressive. There is something else happening in that last hour that I want to share with you because I think it captures the texture of this life more honestly than any broad historical claim. The water. In most rural homes in the 1700s, water came from a well or a nearby stream. There was no running water of any kind, and water was heavy. A single gallon weighs about 8.5 pounds. The household might need 10 to 15 gallons of water for cooking, washing, drinking, and animal care over the course of an evening and the following morning. That water had to be drawn and carried before dark, because drawing water from a well in complete darkness, with only a small candle lantern, was slow and genuinely risky. Drop the bucket down the wrong way, lose your grip on the rope, and you have a problem. So someone, usually a child old enough to carry it, but young enough to still be assigned the task, made multiple trips to the well in that last hour of daylight, filling the large ceramic or wooden water vessels kept inside the house, each trip perhaps 100 yards, each bucket perhaps 2 gallons, 4 or 5 trips to get what was needed. By our modern standards, just this one task, carrying water, would qualify as a workout. For a child in the 1700s, it was simply Tuesday. Now I want to pause here and ask you something honestly. We talk about self-care a lot in the modern world, about protecting our energy, about setting boundaries with our time, and I am not dismissing any of that. Those things matter. But there is something quietly profound about looking at these people and seeing a different kind of self-care. The act of completing your evening tasks was not optional personal growth. It was literal self-preservation. They worked as hard as they did in that last golden hour because their survival, and the survival of everyone in that house, depended directly on what they did before the light ran out. And here is what moves me about this. They did not experience it as heroic. They did not Instagram their woodpile or write in their journals about how disciplined they were. For them this was simply life, the ordinary texture of an ordinary evening. The sun was going down. There was work to do. So you did it. There is something in that, a kind of quiet, unglamorous resilience that I think we have lost a little in the modern world, and I find myself genuinely admiring it. Let me bring you back to that family one more time as the last light begins to fade. The chickens are in, the pig is secured, the water is drawn, the fire has been built up for the evening. The father is walking back from the barn, hands, rough shoulders, tired in the particular way that only physical labour produces. The oldest boy is putting away the tools because tools left outside overnight could rust, or be damaged by dew, or simply be lost in the dark. The smallest children are already inside, sitting near the warmth of the hearth, watching their mother work. The smell in that house right now is wood smoke, and the faint sweetness of whatever is simmering in the pot. The sounds are the crackle of the fire, the low moan of wind around the walls, the distant settling sounds of animals in their pens. Outside the sky is darkening fast. The stars are beginning to appear brilliant, thick with stars the way modern people almost never see, because there is no artificial light for miles in any direction. The Milky Way is visible on clear nights as a solid band of light across the sky. Beautiful, yes, but not soft, not romantic in the way we use that word today, because the family inside that small house knows that the beauty of that sky means the workday is over and the night with all its uncertainties and challenges has officially begun. What happens next? What unfolds inside those walls after the door closes and the night presses in from all sides is what this entire series is about. The fire at the centre of everything. The meal that was nothing like what you imagine. The mother who will not rest for hours yet. The children navigating a darkness we can barely picture. The prayers before sleep and the fears that lived alongside them. We have only just crossed the threshold. The evening is just beginning. Come with me. The next part of this story is waiting for you, and what you're about to learn about the heart of a 1700s home will genuinely change how you think about the simplest thing in your house tonight, a warm light in the dark. There is a sound most of us have forgotten. Not a dramatic sound, not a thunderclap or a church bell or the roar of a crowd, just the quiet, constant low crackling of a wood fire, the way it shifts and breathes, the way it lights one side of a face and leaves the other in shadow, the way it fills a room with a warmth that no central heating system has ever fully replicated, because it is not just warmth you feel, it is presence. For the people living in ordinary homes in the 1700s, fire was not a feature of the evening. It was the evening. It was every evening. And once you understand what the hearth truly meant to a family in that time, what it demanded, what it gave, what it took away, when it was gone, you will never look at a flickering candle or a gas fireplace the same way again. Let us step inside. The first thing you would notice walking into a typical colonial American farmhouse in the mid-1700s is that the fireplace is enormous. Not the tasteful decorative fireplaces we see in magazines today, narrow, shallow, framed with painted mantle and polished tile. The colonial hearth was a working hearth, and it was built to match the scale of that work. In the oldest New England homes, a cooking hearth could be 6, 7, even 8 feet wide enough that you could step inside it, and in fact many colonial cooks did exactly that, stepping up onto the hearthstone to stir a pot or adjust a spit surrounded on 3 sides by burning wood and radiating heat. Some of these fireplaces were so large that families built a small bench into the side of the chimney, opening a warm seat tucked just inside the flue where a child could sit and stay close to the heat on a bitter winter night. This spot had a name. It was called the inglenook, from an old Scottish word for the corner of a fire, and if you were a small child in a colonial home, being allowed to sit in the inglenook was about as good as life got. The hearth was the geographic centre of the home in more than just a physical sense. In New England especially, homes were built deliberately around their central chimney, a massive column of brick or stone that often weighed several tons and ran straight through the heart of the structure. Multiple fireplaces on different floors all fed into this single central chimney. The logic was elegant that huge mass of brick would absorb heat during the day and radiate it slowly outward through the night, acting almost like a giant storage battery for warmth. Architects and historians call this the thermal mass principle, and it was not an accident. Colonial builders understood it intuitively even without the vocabulary to explain it. But here is the thing I want you to truly feel, not just understand intellectually. In the 1700s, the fire in that hearth was not something you turned on. It was not something that started itself, waited for you, or came back automatically if it went out. The fire was a living thing, genuinely treated as such by the people who depended on it, and it had to be tended, fed, managed, and protected every single hour of every single day. The first and most important rule of colonial homemaking was this: the fire must not go out. Not because it would be inconvenient, because it could take hours to restart. And in those hours in January in Pennsylvania or Massachusetts, or Virginia, without insulation in the walls, without double-pane glass in the windows, without the option of going to a thermostat, those hours could mean real suffering. Now I know what you might be thinking. Can it really be that hard to restart a fire? You just strike a match, right? Except there were no matches. This is the detail that stops people cold every single time I mention it. The friction match, the small wooden stick with a phosphorus tip that you drag across a rough surface and it lights instantly, was not invented until the 1820s. And even then it took decades to become widely available to ordinary households. For people living in the 1700s, starting a fire from nothing required flint steel and a bundle of tinder, dry bark, dried moss, sometimes scraps of linen char cloth that had been specially prepared to catch a spark. You struck the flint against the steel, threw sparks into the tinder, blew gently, carefully, and hoped the tiny ember held. Then you transferred it to your kindling. Then, if everything went perfectly, you had a small flame. On a warm summer morning with dry materials and rested hands, an experienced housewife might accomplish this in a few minutes. On a cold winter morning, when the tinder had absorbed overnight moisture from the damp air, when her fingers were stiff, when the children were crying for breakfast, it could take much, much longer. Or it could fail entirely. This is why every single night before the family went to sleep, someone performed a ritual that had a specific name. They covered the fire, not extinguished, it covered it. The embers were raked carefully into a central pile, and then covered with a thick layer of ash, which acted as an insulating blanket, slowing the burn almost to nothing, while preserving a core of live coal at the centre. This device even had its own name in colonial America and England, a curfew. Not the word we use today to mean a time you have to be home, though interestingly, they share the same French root couvre-feu, meaning cover fire. The curfew was a dome of brass or copper shaped like a half-moon that was placed directly over the banked coals each night to protect them from drafts and hold the heat. Every morning before she did anything else, before the children were roused, before breakfast was considered, before the day's work began, the woman of the house went to the hearth. She pushed aside the curfew. She found the buried ember in the ash. She coaxed it back to life with a bellows, those simple leather and wood tools designed to push a focused stream of air across dying coals, and if the ember was still alive, it caught. The fire returned. The day could begin. A Long Island farm wife named Mary Cooper, who kept a remarkable diary between the years 1768 and 1773, wrote with quiet exhaustion about her daily routine, the endless cooking, the cleaning, the worry. "It is now bedtime, and I've not had 1 minute's rest today," she wrote one November evening. That line has stayed with me since I first read it. Not 1 minute. In a single day that had begun at first light and ended at the edge of collapse, and somewhere in that day she had tended the fire. Probably without writing about it, because it did not need to be recorded. It was simply what you did. Let me take you through what a colonial woman actually had to know about fire, because this is where I think modern people are most surprised. Running a hearth-based kitchen was not a matter of just keeping wood burning. It was a form of applied chemistry practiced entirely without formal education, passed from mother to daughter, over generations through demonstration and practice. Different types of wood burned differently, and knowing which wood to use for which purpose was essential practical knowledge. Hardwoods like oak ash and hickory burned hot and long, producing the dense, stable bed of coals ideal for slow cooking a pot of beans or stew through an entire afternoon. Softwoods like pine burned fast and bright, useful for getting a fire started, or producing a quick burst of heat, but leaving behind a weaker coal bed. Cherry wood burned clean and added a faint sweetness to roasting meat. Fruitwoods were prized for that quality. Green wood freshly cut and still holding moisture was nearly useless for cooking, producing more steam and smoke than heat. All wood had to be split-stacked and left to dry for months before it was ready to use. The colonial cook also managed what we might call burners, not knobs on a stove, but actual arrangements of live coals on the hearthstone. She would pull a pile of embers to one spot for high heat, spread them thin in another spot for a gentle simmer, and arrange a Dutch oven, that squat, heavy cast-iron pot, with a flanged lid directly in the coals, with more coals piled on top of the lid, creating an oven-like heat that could bake cornbread or a pie from below and above simultaneously. She could roast meat on a spit suspended between iron and irons, the Y-shaped metal stands you see in historical photographs of colonial hearths. She could boil a kettle hung from an iron crane, that elegant hinged arm bolted to the inside wall of the chimney, which she could swing out toward the room to check on the contents of a pot without having to reach into the fire itself. Each of these techniques required experience and judgment. There were no dials, no thermometers, no timers. You knew the bread was ready when the crust sounded hollow if you tapped it. You knew the beans were done when they softened to a certain resistance under a wooden spoon. You knew the fire was at the right temperature for baking because you had done it 100 times before, and your instincts had been built by every one of those experiences. I want to be honest with you about something here. When I read accounts of what these women managed in that single room with those basic tools day after day after day, I feel something close to awe. Not the performative kind, the real kind. The kind that quietly rearranges your sense of what competence and intelligence look like. There was another dimension to the hearth that is easy to miss when you focus only on the practical side of it. The fire was also the only light in the room. On a winter evening, once the sun had set, which could happen as early as 4:30 in the afternoon, in New England in December, the only illumination inside that one-room house came from the fire. Candles supplemented it, yes, but candles were expensive, they burned quickly, and they required the expensive tallow or beeswax to make them. Many families rationed their candles carefully. The fire was free, or rather it was already burning anyway, and its light was substantial. Have you ever sat in a room lit only by firelight? I mean truly, only by firelight, no phone screen, no street light seeping under the curtains, no indicator, light from the television. If you have, you know, it is remarkably bright when the fire is going well. It throws moving, shifting shadows. It illuminates the center of a room in warm amber. Faces glow. Objects at the edges of the room dissolve into darkness. Families arranged their evening activities around this light source the way we arrange furniture around a television. The closest seat to the hearth was the most desirable, warmest, and best lit. The mother's chair, by common understanding in most households, was placed close to the fire because she was the one who would be sewing or mending by its light after supper. The father might sit with a pipe, and the almanac, Poor Richard's Almanac by Benjamin Franklin, was one of the most widely read publications in colonial America through the mid-1700s, consulted for weather predictions, planting advice, and the occasional wry proverb. Children sat at the edges of the firelight and told each other things in low voices. Now I want to ask you something, and I mean this genuinely. When was the last time you sat near something warm and real and just let it hold the room for a while? Not a screen, not music from a speaker, just warmth and light that you didn't create with a switch. There is something in that specific experience, the fire as the center of the evening, that I believe we have lost without quite knowing what we lost. The colonial family did not choose the fire for aesthetic reasons. They had no alternative, but they got something from it that we have been trying to recreate ever since with scented candles and fireplace YouTube channels and ambient sound apps. The fire forced everyone to be in the same place. It pulled bodies into a circle. It created a boundary between the lit world inside and the dark world outside. And in that boundary, in that small warm circle, something like family life happened, not because anyone planned it, but because the physics of fire made it the only option. By late evening, the room had reached a certain equilibrium. The fire had settled from its cooking height to a slower, warmer glow. The pots had been lifted off the crane and set aside. The iron tools, the tongs, the poker, the long-handled fork rested against the hearthstone. The smell in the room was wood smoke and cooked food, and the faint animal smell of wool clothing warming near the heat. Outside, the winter wind pressed against the walls. Inside, the fire breathed. And sometime in the hour before sleep, someone, the mother, most often performed one final careful act. She raked the embers together. She covered them with a careful layer of ash. She placed the curfew over the top. She made sure the fire would survive the night, because if it did not, morning would be harder than it had to be. And in the 1700s, mornings were already hard. What happened in that room after the fire was banked and the light dimmed, what the family actually ate, who sat where, who was allowed to speak and who was expected to stay quiet, is the story we step into next. And I promise you, the dinner table of a 1700s family will surprise you in ways you're not expecting. The food on that table, the rules around it, the roles inside it, we are just getting to the heart of it. So here is something I want you to do right now. Close your eyes for just a moment, just 5 seconds, and picture a family dinner in the 1700s. What do you see? I am going to guess a long wooden table, a roasted bird of some kind, candles, maybe a pie cooling on the windowsill, earthenware mugs, someone in a long apron, something warm and golden and fragrant. You just imagined a wealthy family's home from a painting, probably English gentry or a successful colonial merchant, or at the very least someone who had enough firewood, enough cookware and enough meat to make a meal that looked like that. But if we are being honest, truly honest, that image describes maybe 10% of the households in colonial America. For the other 90%, the reality of the evening meal was something quite different. And in my opinion, it is actually more interesting. Let's start with the single most important thing to understand about food in the 1700s, and it is something modern people find genuinely hard to absorb. There was no supper as the main event. We are so used to thinking of dinner as an evening meal, the big one, the one the day builds toward, that it requires a real mental adjustment to understand that for most people living in colonial America, the main meal of the day was served in the early afternoon, not at 6 in the evening, not at 7. Around noon or 1 or 2 o'clock in the afternoon, when the physical labour of the morning was done and the body needed its most substantial fuel before the afternoon's work continued. This meal called dinner was when most of the household's real cooking effort went. It was when the pot of beans that had been simmering since morning would be served, when a piece of salt pork, if the family had it, might be eaten with cornbread or a thick pudding, when the bulk of the day's calories were consumed because the body needed them for the afternoon ahead. The evening meal had a different name entirely, supper, and supper for most ordinary families in the 1700s was a modest, quiet thing. Often it was not cooked fresh at all. Supper, in the words of food historians who have reconstructed these meals from household records and newspaper accounts, was a smaller meal often similar to breakfast bread, cheese mush, or hasty pudding, or warmed over meat from the noon meal. Read that again slowly, because I think it is one of those sentences that sounds simple until you really sit with it. Bread, cheese, mush, or whatever was left from lunch. There was no concept of waste. Everything from the midday meal that had not been eaten was saved carefully in a covered pot near the cooling embers, and reheated or served cold at the evening table. The pot of beans from noon appeared again at supper. The corn porridge that had been left on the trivet all afternoon was ladled out again into wooden bowls. In winter the cold worked in their favour, Foods preserved well against stone walls and in root cellars. In summer, everything had to move faster because in the heat food turned. And here is the thing that I think reveals the most about this life. Nobody thought this was deprivation. This was simply Tuesday. This was simply how meals worked, embedded in the rhythm of a body that had been working since before dawn and would need to be in bed before the last of the evening light faded. You ate what you had, you ate it when you needed it, and then you went on. Now let us talk about what was actually in those pots. Because this is where things get genuinely fascinating. The single most common ingredient in the diet of an ordinary colonial family was pork. Not fresh pork, most of the time salt pork. Pork that had been preserved in brine or rubbed with salt during the autumn slaughter and stored in barrels through the winter. It was not elegant, but it was functional in a way that nothing else matched. It was cheap to produce, it lasted for months without spoiling. If properly salted, it added fat and protein to almost any dish, and virtually every farm family kept at least one pig. Salt pork went into the bean pot. It went into the stew. It flavoured the cornmeal porridge. A slice of it fried in its own fat in a cast-iron spider, that shallow pan with small legs that stood directly in the hot embers, gave a simple meal something savoury and satisfying. One American physician writing in the mid-1800s somewhat unkindly observed that the diet of the ordinary American household revolved so heavily around pork that the United States might fairly be called, in his words, the Republic of Porkdom. He was exaggerating, of course, but only slightly. Corn was the other pillar. Not the sweet yellow corn on the cob that fills summer farmers' markets today, field corn dried and ground into meal, which was the daily bread of most ordinary colonial households. Cornmeal made hasty pudding, also called Indian pudding, which was simply cornmeal boiled in water or milk into a thick, warm porridge. A cookbook published in 1724 described hasty pudding as cheap and very acceptable, which is one of those phrases that reveals a great deal about how humbly a food was positioned and how widely it was eaten. Gulielma Penn, wife of the founder of Pennsylvania, included a hasty pudding recipe in her family's cookbook in 1702. It was eaten by founding father families and by subsistence farmers alike. It was the great equalizer of colonial kitchens. Cornmeal also made Johnny cakes, thin flat cakes mixed with water and salt, sometimes an egg if the hens had laid that day cooked on a board propped before the fire, or on a smooth stone directly on the hearthstone. No pan required, no special equipment, just heat and patience, and a woman who had done this so many times that she could judge the doneness by the colour and the faint sound the cake made when she tapped it. I want to pause here and talk about something that I find quietly profound about this food. We live in an era of extraordinary culinary variety. Most Americans can walk into a grocery store and find ingredients from dozens of countries, preserved through technologies that would have seemed like pure magic to a colonial housewife. We have almost forgotten what it feels like to cook within genuine constraints, to make a meal from only what is in the house, only what grew that season, only what survived the preservation process. The colonial cook did not have this luxury, and yet the food she produced was not joyless. It was not merely fuel. Families looked forward to meals. Children remembered the smell of the pot from their childhoods. Seasonal foods, the first strawberries of summer, the apple cider pressed in autumn, the fresh fish pulled from a river in spring were genuinely exciting precisely because they were temporary. There is something about constraint that sharpens appreciation. It is a lesson that I think about sometimes when I'm standing in front of a refrigerator with 100 options and somehow cannot decide what I want to eat. Let me bring you to the table itself now, because the physical act of eating in the 1700s was different from what we do today in ways that are sometimes funny, sometimes surprising, and occasionally a little alarming by modern standards. Most ordinary families in the early to mid-1700s did not have individual plates for each person at supper. They ate from trenchers, carved wooden dishes oblong or square in shape, with a shallow depression in the centre. But here is the part that surprises people every time trenchers were typically shared. 2 people to 1 trencher was standard. A husband and wife sharing siblings, sharing sometimes guests, sharing with strangers if space was tight. An early Connecticut church deacon, according to historians who documented this period of New England social life, actually got the cold shoulder from his neighbours when he carved enough individual trenchers so that each of his children could have their own. It was considered excessive, showy, the kind of extravagance that good, modest people did not engage in. Let that sit for a moment. Individual plates for your children excessive and showy. Forks were genuinely rare throughout most of the 1700s in ordinary households. Massachusetts Governor John Winthrop was recorded as having the first fork in colonial New England, which he obtained in 1633. A single fork. And he was the governor. For ordinary families, the eating utensils were a knife, a wooden spoon, and most commonly the hands. Napkins were not a sign of formality. They were a practical necessity because people ate with their fingers far more often than we tend to imagine. The drink at supper in most colonial households was not water. This is another detail that stops modern people cold. Water from wells and streams in the 1700s was often genuinely unsafe, contaminated by animal waste, by runoff, by the proximity of outhouses and barns. The colonists were not wrong to be suspicious of it. They drank instead what they knew from England's cider beer, and for the wealthier tea. Hard cider made from pressed apples was the working-class drink of the American colonies, in the way that beer was in England. It was cheap, it was everywhere, and crucially, the fermentation process killed the bacteria that made the water dangerous. Even children drank watered-down cider or very small beer at ordinary meals. This was not excessive or irresponsible by the standards of the time. It was sensible. Now I want to give you a sense of what actually varied across this landscape, because colonial America was not a single uniform world of identical families eating identical meals. Along the New England coast, a family might have cod salted or fresh, depending on the season, as the centre of the evening meal. Lobster was so abundant in colonial New England waters that it was sometimes used as fish bait, and there are historical accounts of it being fed to servants and apprentices so frequently that some labour contracts were written specifically to limit how often an employer could serve lobster. That detail alone tells you everything about how dramatically abundance reshapes what is considered a delicacy. In the middle colonies, German immigrant families had brought their tradition of slow-cooked stews and one-pot meals, and by the mid-1700s these were woven into the food culture of Pennsylvania and New York. Apple dumplings boiled in a pot were noted by travellers as appearing on tables in the Delaware Valley with near-daily frequency. Scrapple, a dense, savoury loaf made from pork scraps and cornmeal, was already a staple of regional cooking. In the South, the food culture was shaped by a deeply troubling history that nonetheless had a profound culinary legacy. The enslaved people who did the cooking brought with them knowledge of okra, black-eyed peas, sweet potatoes, and sesame seeds from West Africa. These ingredients and the slow-cooking one-pot techniques that accompanied them transformed the food of the southern colonies in ways that are still visible in American cooking today. Let me come back to that ordinary supper table one more time, because there is something I want you to feel rather than just understand. It is evening. The light is low. The fire has come down from its cooking height to a slower, quieter burn. The children are seated, some of the smaller ones standing actually, because there might not be enough bench space for everyone, and it was considered acceptable for children to stand at the side of the table and be handed what they were given without complaint. The trencher between 2 people holds hasty pudding thickened and warm. There's a piece of dense cornbread broken and shared. There may be a heel of salt pork soft from the pot. There is a wooden tankard of hard cider passed around the table. There is no fussing about what you prefer or whether you feel like eating. You eat what is there because what is what there is. And here is what strikes me honestly and personally: there was almost no food waste in this household. Not because they were virtuous in some abstract environmental sense, but because waste was a luxury they could not afford. Every scrap of fat was rendered for cooking or candle making. Every bone was boiled for broth. Every stale piece of bread was soaked and repurposed. The trencher itself, in the very earliest colonial period, had been a slab of stale bread eaten or given to the animals after the meal. We could spend a great deal of time debating what this life lacked compared to ours, but sitting with this meal for a moment, I find myself thinking about what it had. Simplicity, efficiency, a complete absence of the modern anxiety about food, the calorie counting, the dietary categories, the infinite paralysis of too many choices. They knew what they were eating. They knew where it came from. They had made it, or grown it, or preserved it themselves. In its own strange way that feels like something worth noticing, the meal was ending. The trenchers were scraped clean. The cider tankard made its final round. Outside, the night had fully settled in. Inside, the fire was down to a comfortable glow, and the room was warm in the particular way that only a hearth creates warm in the centre cooler toward the walls, with a ring of amber light that held the family together. And now something was about to happen at that table that would tell you more about how this family actually worked than anything the food could reveal. The question of who sat where, who spoke and who stayed quiet, who was served first and who waited, what the rules were, who enforced them, and what it meant to break them. The table in a 1700s home was not just a surface for eating. It was a stage for the entire social order of the family, and when you see what that order looked like and how seriously people took it, it will change the way you understand this world. You know that thing at Thanksgiving or Christmas or any family gathering big enough that you run out of chairs where the kids get exiled to the small table in the corner? The folding table with the plastic chairs and the slightly wobbly leg, the table that everyone calls with a kind of cheerful cruelty, the children's table. We laugh about it. We complain about it. Eventually getting to sit at the adult table becomes this quiet rite of passage, this unspoken signal that you have finally arrived. Well, that tradition did not spring from nowhere. It has roots, deep roots, in the way ordinary families in the 1700s understood what a table was for. And once you understand those roots, the dinner table of an 18th century colonial family begins to reveal something far more complex than just a place to eat. It was a stage, and every person at that table had a role they were expected to play without improvisation, without complaint, and almost without speech. Let us start at the head of the table, because that is where everything radiates outward from. The father sat at the head, not because it was a pleasant custom or a quaint tradition, but because in the eyes of colonial law and colonial theology alike, the father was the literal authority of the household, not metaphorically, not symbolically, but legally, and in terms of direct religious obligation. The Reverend John Cotton of Massachusetts Bay Colony articulated what most colonial communities believed when he described the household as a mirror of the Commonwealth. The father governed the family the way magistrates governed the colony, and God governed all. The family was a small theocracy, and the father was its appointed ruler. Under colonial law, this was not an abstraction. A married woman had no independent legal identity. She could not own property, could not make a will, could not sign a contract, could not appear in court as a witness. The legal term for this status was feme covert, literally covered woman, meaning her identity was subsumed entirely under her husband's. He represented her. He spoke for her. In a very real sense, she ceased to exist as a legal person upon marriage. None of this was considered cruel by the people who lived inside it. It was simply the water they swam in, the natural order ordained by God, confirmed by law, reinforced by community expectation. A wife who publicly contradicted her husband was not just being rude. She was violating a moral framework that her neighbours took seriously and that her church would not hesitate to address. So where did the wife sit? She sat at the opposite end of the table facing her husband. This positioning was not accidental. It was the arrangement that mirrored the structure of the household itself. The husband at one end, authority flowing from him down the length of the table. The wife at the other end managing the household machinery, the serving, the portioning, the watching of each child's needs while he presided. Between them, along the sides of the table, sat the children arranged by age. The oldest near the parents, the youngest further away. In households with servants or hired workers who ate with the family, which was common in colonial America since wealthy enough families to keep entirely separate quarters for help were relatively rare, the servants sat lowest, below the youngest child, at the very edge of the circle of belonging. And here is where I want to return to something from the last segment we discussed, because it connects to all of this in a way I find genuinely remarkable. That salt cellar sitting in the middle of the table was not just a container for seasoning, it was a physical marker of social rank. In a tradition brought directly from medieval Europe, the people seated above the salt, meaning near the head of the table, where the host and honoured guests sat, were people of standing and importance. The people seated below the salt, literally on the other side of the cellar from the hosts, were of lower status. Children, servants, and undistinguished guests all fell below the salt. Harvard University was gifted a large silver standing salt in 1644, which was placed on the dining table specifically to divide the faculty from the undergraduates. Think about that. A university founded to train ministers and scholars used a salt shaker to mark who mattered and who mattered less. The phrase below the salt entered the English language as an expression for social inferiority, and it is still used today, though almost no one who uses it knows what it originally referred to. Now let us talk about the children, because this is the part of the colonial dinner table that I find most striking when I try to imagine it through the eyes of a modern parent. Children did not sit down when they felt ready. They did not reach for food when they were hungry. They did not speak unless spoken to. A book called The School of Manners, written by John Garretson, and published in London in 1701, was widely circulated in colonial America and represented the standard of behaviour that respectable families aspired to. Some of its rules for children at the table read almost like a list of everything a modern child is actively encouraged to do. Rule 2. Sit not down till thou art bidden by thy parents or superiors. Rule 9. Speak not at the table. If thy superiors be discoursing, meddle not with the matter. Rule 15. Stare not in the face of anyone, especially thy superior at the table. And then there is the one that stopped me completely the first time I read it. In many colonial households, not just in theory, not just in the writings of moralists, but in documented practice across New England and the middle colonies, children were not permitted to sit at all. They stood behind the adults during the meal. They waited to be handed food. They ate whatever was given to them without requesting anything different. A food historian documenting colonial dining practices wrote plainly, "In many households in the New World, children could not be seated at the table even after the blessing had been asked. They stood through the entire meal. Sometimes they had a standing place and a plate or trencher. At other boards they stood behind the grown folk and took whatever food was handed back to them." I want to be honest about something here because I think it is worth naming. When I first encountered this, my instinct was to judge it harshly. Standing children silence children, it sounds through a modern lens like something close to unkindness. But the more I read about what these families believed, the more I understand that it was not cruelty they were aiming for. it was formation. They genuinely believed that a child who learned early to wait to be quiet, to accept what they were given without complaint, would grow into an adult of character and self-command. The dinner table was not just where you ate, it was where you practiced being a person of a specific kind. Whether we agree with that philosophy or not, and I am not sure I do entirely, it is worth understanding it on its own terms before we dismiss it. There is one more dimension to this table that I want to spend some time with, and it is the one that I think says the most about the values of this world: the blessing. No meal in a colonial household began without prayer, not a perfunctory mumbled grace that takes 3 seconds and is over before you've unfolded your napkin. A real prayer, sometimes extended, sometimes including a reading from Scripture, always spoken by the father as his role as the head of the household's spiritual life required. George Washington, as young man, copied out a list of 110 rules of civility that had been circulating in various forms since the 16th century, drawn from French Jesuit courtesy manuals and adapted for the English-speaking world. The rules covered everything from table manners, being set at meat, do not scratch, cough, or blow your nose except there is necessity for it, to the deeper obligations of a person of character. What is remarkable about this document is that Washington did not think these rules were unusual or excessive. He copied them as a young teenager, apparently because he intended to follow them, and there is evidence throughout his life that he largely did. The rules reflected a world in which the dinner table was not casual. It was formal even in its informality. It was the place where the family's values were enacted, not merely discussed, where the father's authority was displayed through who he served first and how he spoke, where the wife's competence was visible in the quality of what reached the table and the smoothness of the evening, where children demonstrated or failed to demonstrate that the lessons they were receiving were taking hold. Now I want to ask you something, and I genuinely want you to think about it. When you eat with your family tonight, or the next time you share a meal with people you love, what is that table doing for you beyond feeding your body? What roles are being performed at it, even without anyone naming them? Who speaks most? Who manages the logistics of the meal invisibly? Who has authority, and where does it come from? I ask this not because I think the 1700s had it right. They clearly had aspects of family life that we have rightly moved beyond, but because I think the people of that time understood something that we have become a little too casual about, that a table and the rituals around it can be a place where the most important things about a family become visible, where values are transmitted, where belonging is enacted. They took it seriously, maybe too seriously in some ways. But there is something in that seriousness worth noticing. Let me bring you back to the room one final time this evening, that small, warm, firelit room where the supper is ending. The food has been eaten, the children have been quiet, the father has finished speaking, the evening prayer will come before bed, and now, as the table is cleared, as the trenchers are wiped and stacked, as the tankard is set aside and the fire is banked lower, the woman of that house is still working. She has been working since before dawn. She will work for another hour yet. And the nature of that labour, the invisible, relentless, utterly unglamorous work of a colonial woman, after the table is cleared and the children begin to drift towards sleep, is a story that almost no one thought to write down, which is exactly why it deserves to be told now. Picture this for a moment. It is a Tuesday evening in November. You're sitting in your living room. Maybe you have a lamp on beside you, or the glow of a screen nearby, or the overhead light you switched on without thinking when the sun went down. The room is bright enough to read, bright enough to see every corner, clearly bright enough that darkness feels entirely optional, something that exists only outdoors, something you can choose to step into and back out of at will. Now imagine that light costs you something, not a monthly bill that you pay and forget, not a subscription, something more direct than that. Imagine that every additional hour of light in your home requires you to have planned ahead, worked hard, smelled terrible for an entire day, and rationed what you made so carefully that you know exactly how many hours of brightness your family has between now and spring. That was the reality of every ordinary family in the 1700s. And once you understand what light actually cost them in labour and money, in the constant low-grade anxiety of running out, you begin to understand something about their evenings that no history book quite captures directly. Darkness was not an inconvenience. It was a force to be managed, negotiated with, and defeated one small flame at a time. Let us start with the most basic question. What were these candles actually made of? For the overwhelming majority of colonial families, the farming families, the tradespeople, the ordinary households that made up the vast bulk of the population, the answer was tallow. Animal fat. Specifically the rendered fat of cattle and sheep, which was saved throughout the year, stored in covered crocks to keep it from going completely rancid, and then processed in a great exhausting batch every autumn. The timing of candle making was not random. It happened in early to mid-November immediately following the autumn slaughter of livestock. This was the one moment in the year when fat was available in quantity, fresh from the animals that would not survive the winter on scarce feed. The fat was cut into pieces, melted down in enormous kettles hung over the fire, boiled and strained and purified, and then used to dip hundreds of wicks in the painstaking process of building candles layer by layer. I want you to understand what this day actually looked like, because it was nothing like the charming craft project that the word candle making might suggest to a modern mind. The kettles were heavy. The tallow was scalding. The smell, and I am not going to soften this, was genuinely awful. Rendered animal fat has a particular odour that clings to everything: your hair, your clothes, the walls of the room where you worked. It was not a smell you could step away from. It filled the house for the entire day. One account from a colonial-era farmhouse described the autumn candle making as a task that every member of the household dreaded, and every member of the household knew could not be avoided. The dipping process itself was relentlessly repetitive. A set of wicks made from linen thread, cotton, hemp, or twisted milkweed fibre was attached to wooden rods. Those rods were dipped into the melted tallow, held up to cool and harden, then dipped again, and again, and again. Each pass added only a thin layer of fat. A typical candle required between 30 and 40 dips to reach a usable thickness. Multiply that by the 300 to 400 candles an average colonial family needed for a single year, and you begin to grasp the scale of the undertaking. 300 candles. That was roughly 1 candle per day, and it was considered adequate, not generous. Now, not all candles were created equal, and this is where the story of colonial lighting becomes genuinely fascinating, because the type of candle burning in your home was one of the most visible markers of your family's wealth and social standing. Tallow candles were the bottom of the hierarchy. They were cheap, they were homemade, and they were almost universally the only kind that ordinary families could afford. They also had significant drawbacks beyond the smell of their production. Tallow candles burned unevenly, they smoked, they guttered. Their wicks required trimming called snuffing several times an hour, because if the charred end of the wick was not cut back regularly, it would cause the flame to smoke heavily and burn faster. A pair of candle snuffers, which looked like small scissors, was a household tool used constantly during any evening of reading or work by candlelight. Forget to snuff, and your candle consumed itself in minutes. One material specialist at Colonial Williamsburg documented the burn times carefully. A well-made tallow candle about 3/4 of an inch in diameter and 10 inches long might burn for 2 hours under ideal conditions. A bayberry candle of the same size could last 8 hours. A beeswax candle might burn for 10, and the finest candle available, spermaceti made from the crystallized oil of the sperm whale's skull cavity, could burn even longer with a cleaner, brighter flame than anything else available in the 18th century. The gap between tallow and spermaceti was not just a matter of comfort. It was a gap of an entirely different quality of life after dark. Beeswax candles burned pure and clean without producing the sputtering smoky flame of tallow. They emitted a faint sweet honey smell rather than the acrid greasy odour that tallow candles spread through a room. They did not require constant snuffing, and they could be left unattended for long periods without melting into a puddle of fat on a warm evening. But beeswax was expensive and relatively rare, and for most of the 1700s, beeswax candles in the home were the province of the wealthy. They were used routinely in churches where their cleaner burn made them appropriate for sacred spaces, but for a farming family to burn beeswax by the evening in their own kitchen was an extravagance beyond consideration. Spermaceti candles were even further out of reach. They appear in the estate inventories of only the wealthiest colonial households. The whaling industry that produced spermaceti wax was centred in New England, particularly Nantucket and New Bedford, and expanded significantly in the mid-1700s, but the candles they produced were traded commodities, not everyday household items for ordinary people. Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment. When you imagine a colonial family gathered in the evening, you probably picture something warm and golden, a fire crackling candlelight, dancing faces illuminated in a soft amber glow. And that image is not entirely wrong, but it is much dimmer than you think. A single tallow candle produces about the same amount of light as a modern 1-watt light bulb. 1 watt. The average table lamp in your home is probably 60 watts. Your kitchen ceiling light may be well over 100. An ordinary colonial family in the evening might have 1, maybe 2 candles burning, not because they lacked taste or imagination, but because candles were a rationed resource, and burning 3 candles simultaneously in a single room was considered almost profligate, a kind of waste that responsible households simply did not engage in. The colonial Williamsburg research records include a letter from a plantation owner who wrote that he feared he would have to be contented to sit in the dark because his shipment of candles from a chandler in Norfolk had not arrived. Not a dramatic statement, just the straightforward anxiety of a man who understood that light was finite, and the evening was long. 1 hour of light. That was the implicit unit of calculation in a 1700s household. Every candle lit, every inch of wick burned was a small deduction from a finite annual account. The thriftiest families burned candles only when the work at hand genuinely required it, and relied on the firelight for everything else, which is one reason that the hearth was positioned so centrally in the colonial home, and why the family arranged themselves around it so completely in the evenings. There is something else about colonial candlelight that I find almost unbearably poignant when I think about it. The women in these households, the ones who spent a full autumn day in the stench of rendering tallow, who counted candles through the winter, the way you might count a last bottle of something irreplaceable, were also the ones who burned those candles longest into the evening. Because while the men of the household and the children went to bed with the dark, the women often stayed up. Sewing needed to be finished, cloth needed to be spun, stockings needed mending, accounting for the household stores needed to be done while the numbers were still fresh. The domestic labour that could not be completed by daylight, and in a colonial household, there was always more of it than daylight hours allowed, was completed by candlelight, which means that the woman who made the candles was also the woman who burned them last. There are a particular kind of exhaustion in that image that I do not think any list of historical facts quite conveys. The cost of 1 hour of light was not just the fat of one butchered animal or the day of labour over smoking kettles in November. It was also the choice to spend that hour working in the small precious circle of flame rather than sleeping. It was the calculation made every evening of what was worth burning a candle for. Bayberry candles deserve a brief mention here because they represent one of the genuinely beautiful discoveries of the colonial period. Sometime in the early 1700s, women living near the coast of Cape Cod noticed that the greyish-green berries of the bayberry bush, when boiled, produced a layer of greenish wax that floated to the surface and could be skimmed off. This wax burned cleanly smelled pleasant, a subtle herbal sweetness rather than the greasiness of tallow, and held up in summer heat far better than animal fat. The drawback was the quantity required. Roughly 15 pounds of bayberries were needed to produce a single pound of bayberry wax, which yielded perhaps a handful of candles. The harvesting and boiling of bayberries was itself a significant labour. Most families who used bayberry wax blended it into their tallow candles, rather than using it alone, which improved both the smell and the burn time, without requiring the impossible volume of berries that a pure bayberry candle would need. There is an old New England saying, "A bayberry candle burned to the socket puts luck in the home gold in the pocket." It was repeated at Christmas when bayberry candles were traditionally lit. Whether people believed it or simply liked the ritual, the saying suggests something true. A bayberry candle was considered a gift, a small luxury, something not to be burned carelessly. In a world where light was rationed, even the smell of how it burned was worth noticing. I want to leave you with one final thought before we move on, and it is one that I keep returning to whenever I think about this period. We have access to an almost incomprehensible abundance of light. We can illuminate every room of our homes completely at any hour at almost no cost. We have forgotten entirely that light was once a resource that required labour planning and sacrifice. We have forgotten what it felt like to sit in a room and make a conscious choice about whether a candle was worth burning. And in forgetting that, I wonder if we have also lost a certain quality of attention, the kind that comes from sitting in near darkness, with only the firelight and one small flame, with nowhere else to look and nothing else to do but be present with the people in the room. The colonial evening, for all its hardships, enforced a kind of stillness that our modern abundance has made entirely optional. That stillness had a cost, and the women who paid it night after night, threading their needles by a single guttering flame, knew exactly what it was worth. And speaking of those women, because they keep pulling me back, and rightly so, what exactly was happening in that colonial home after the candle was lit and the children were meant to be settling towards sleep? What did a mother actually do in those quiet candlelit hours when the household was theoretically at rest? The answer is more than you might expect, and far less restful than the word evening implies. There is an old saying, so old that most people have forgotten where it came from, that goes like this: "A man works from sun to sun, but a woman's work is never done." It sounds like a complaint. It sounds like something a tired woman might mutter under her breath while her husband snores beside her. But when you trace that phrase back to its origins, you find something more interesting than bitterness. You find an accurate description of an economic and social system that was so entrenched, so deeply embedded in the fabric of colonial life, that most of the women living inside it did not even have the language to name what was happening to them. They just kept working. And nowhere is this more visible than in the hours after dark, when the rest of the household had finally gone quiet. Let us set the scene properly, because the details matter here. The supper has been eaten, the table has been cleared, the children have been sent toward bed either willingly or with the usual amount of resistance that children have always offered at that particular hour. The husband has settled, perhaps reading, perhaps conducting business by candlelight, perhaps simply resting after a day of outdoor physical labour that genuinely did exhaust him. The fire has been banked to conserve wood through the night, and the woman of the house is still moving. She's at the spinning wheel if the household is one that produces its own thread. The wheel makes a sound, a low rhythmic hum, that some people find almost musical, and that the woman herself has probably stopped hearing entirely, the way you stop hearing the rain once it has been raining for hours. She is drawing fibre with both hands, walking backward and forward in the repetitive rhythm, that spinning requires a motion so practiced it has become almost unconscious. Or she's at the loom, if the household is larger and more established, the clatter of the shuttle passing through the shed of warp threads, the beat of the beater pressing each row of weft into place. It is not quiet work, but it is nighttime work, and it is necessary. Or she is mending, stockings with holes worn through the heel, a shirt whose collar has frayed from weekly washing, a child's dress that caught on a fence post and tore along the seam. In the 18th century, every piece of fabric was precious enough to be repaired rather than discarded, and the repair work fell almost entirely to the women of the household. I want to pause here and explain something about the economics of cloth in this period, because it reframes every hour of that nighttime labour in a way that I think is genuinely astonishing. Cloth, the raw material of every garment worn by every person in that household, was extraordinarily expensive relative to what a colonial family earned. Not expensive in the way that a luxury item is expensive in the way that a basic necessity can be when there is no industrial machinery to produce it cheaply. Before the textile mills of the Industrial Revolution transformed the market in the early 1800s, the production of any woven fabric required a staggering amount of human time. Consider the full-chain sheep had to be shorn, wool had to be cleaned and carded, combed into alignment with hand tools, then it had to be spun into yarn on a wheel, which required hours of standing and walking for every pound of usable thread. Then the yarn had to be woven into cloth on a loom, which was itself a physically demanding, technically complex process. Then the cloth had to be cut and sewn by hand into garments, a task requiring skill and precision, because there were no sewing machines and every stitch was individual. One historian estimated that producing a single new dress from raw fibre to finished garment could take a woman the equivalent of 4 full weeks of labour. 4 weeks for one dress. This is why clothing was listed in wills. This is why a good winter coat was repaired for decades. This is why the mending pile in a colonial household never entirely disappeared, because it was not laziness that let it accumulate, it was the mathematics of the day. There were simply not enough daylight hours to accomplish everything that needed doing, so some of it was pushed into the evening, into the candlelit hours after supper, into the time that was supposed to be rest. By 1750, surveys from New Hampshire showed that between 65 and 80% of households owned spinning wheels. This was not a hobby, this was infrastructure. The wheel sitting in the corner of the colonial kitchen was as essential to the household's survival as the plough or the cow. But of all the colonial women whose evening labour has survived in the historical record, there is one whose name deserves to be spoken here, because she left behind something almost no other ordinary woman of her time left evidence. Her name was Martha Ballard, and she was a midwife living in Hallowell, Maine. In 1785, at the age of 50, she began keeping a diary, a practice she would continue every day for the next 27 years until her death in 1812. Martha Ballard was by any reasonable measure one of the busiest women in colonial New England. She delivered more than 800 babies over the course of her diary. She made medicines from herbs she grew herself. She crossed rivers by canoe in the dark, rode horses through blizzards, waded through spring mud to reach labouring women on the other side of the Kennebec River. She was called from her bed in the middle of the night so often that the phrase "called at midnight" appears throughout her entries with the matter-of-fact tone of someone describing the weather. And then she came home, and she spun. Her diary entries record it without drama, without complaint, without any apparent sense that the juxtaposition was remarkable. She would return from attending a birth in the early hours of the morning sleep for a few hours, and then note in the same entry that she had spun 6 skeins of linen thread. She finished her husband's linen stockings, according to one entry, at 9 3/4 o'clock at night, Another records that she baked rice puddings in the evening and then sat up another hour with her needlework before bed. For many years, scholars dismissed Martha Ballard's diary as too ordinary to be worth serious study. The historian Laurel Thatcher Ulrich, who spent 8 years researching it before publishing her Pulitzer Prize-winning account of Ballard's life, wrote that the diary had been overlooked precisely because of what made it extraordinary, its exhaustive, repetitious dailiness. The relentless rhythm of domestic work, recorded without self-pity and without celebration, was so unremarkable to the men who first encountered it that they could not see it for what it was. A complete portrait of a world where women's labour sustained everything and was credited with nothing. There is a question I keep coming back to when I think about those evening hours, and I want to ask it directly. Was she lonely? Not lonely in the dramatic sense, not isolated, not abandoned, not bereft of human connection, but lonely in the quieter sense of doing work that no one was watching, work that would leave no visible mark, work that mattered only in the moment of its completion and then disappeared into use. The stocking finished at nearly 10 o'clock at night would be worn and eventually worn out. The thread spun by candlelight would become cloth, that became a shirt, that became a rag, that became nothing. The labour that went into it would never be counted, never appear on any ledger, never be recorded in any census under the heading of gainfully employed. The census takers of that era, when they came to colonial and frontier households, recorded the women they found there as not gainfully employed. Not employed, despite the spinning wheels, despite the looms, despite the medicinal herb gardens and the food preservation and the candle making and the nighttime mending. Despite all of it, I find this one of the most quietly devastating facts in the history of domestic life. Not all of the evening labour was solitary, and this is worth understanding because it reveals something important about how women in this period found both community and sanity in the face of unrelenting work. The quilting bee is the most famous example, but it was only one form of what historians have called work frolics gatherings, where neighbours came together to accomplish a shared domestic task, and turned it by sheer collective will into something that resembled celebration. Women would bring their spinning to a neighbour's house in the evening, and what might have been a solitary hour at the wheel became an hour of conversation, news, laughter, the exchange of remedies and recipes, and the kind of intimate practical knowledge that women passed between themselves because no one else was going to write it down for them. These gatherings were not incidental to colonial women's lives. They were structurally important. They were the mechanism by which knowledge travelled, by which emotional support was provided, by which the isolation of individual farm households was temporarily dissolved. The warmth of a shared evening over shared work was not a luxury. It was a necessity of a different kind, and when the gathering broke up and each woman walked home in the dark carrying her candle, or following the path she knew by feel, she walked back into her own house, her own fire, her own stack of work still unfinished. Here is the thing that strikes me most, and I want to say it plainly before we leave this part of the evening. The women of colonial America did not consider themselves extraordinary. They did not write manifestos. They did not, for the most part, keep diaries. Martha Ballard was exceptional precisely because she did. Most of her neighbours, women who worked just as hard, who spun just as many skeins of thread, and delivered just as many meals and mended just as many garments by failing candlelight. Most of them are completely invisible to history. They lived full lives, difficult lives, lives of genuine competence and endurance, and they left almost no trace. When they died, their obituaries said things like consort of and wife of and named the husband. I think about this sometimes when I hear people speak casually about simpler times, as if the past were restful, as if the evenings in a colonial home were gentle and uncomplicated. They were not simple, they were full full of work that the people doing it considered too ordinary to mention, too necessary to complain about, too essential to stop. The spinning wheel hums, the candle gutters lower, the woman at the wheel keeps drawing thread, and somewhere in that house, likely in the far corner, likely on a straw mattress under a quilt, that the woman of the house stitched herself, the children are sleeping. Or rather, they are supposed to be sleeping. Because if you have ever put a child to bed in a house with no electric light, no device to look at, no white noise machine, and no reliable sense of what might be lurking in the dark beyond the window, you know that supposed to be sleeping and actually sleeping are two very different things. What the children of a colonial household actually experienced after dark, the fears, the rituals, the strange tender moments before sleep is a world unto itself, and it is the next chapter of this evening. Think back for a moment to the last bedtime story you ever heard as a child, or if you are a parent, the last one you told. Odds are it involves some kind of danger, a wolf, a witch, a creature in the forest, but the danger was always safely contained. The story ended well. The child got home. The monster was defeated or revealed to be harmless. The world was restored to order, and you could close your eyes knowing that things were fine. This is what we expect from bedtime stories now. Comfort, containment, the reassurance that the dark holds nothing real. The children of a 1700s home expected something quite different, and the stories told to them at night, when they were told stories at all, reflected a world where the dark was not a literary device. It was simply the dark, and the things that might live in it were not always assumed to be imaginary. Let us start with the bedtime itself, because even the ritual of putting children to sleep in a colonial household was shaped by a theology and a world view that we have almost entirely abandoned. In Puritan New England, which set the cultural tone for much of colonial American family life through the 1700s, children were not considered innocent. They were considered fallen, born into sin as the theology of the time taught it. Children were creatures of natural wickedness, whose souls needed to be brought under the discipline of God and the household before that wickedness took hold permanently. This sounds harsh, and by modern standards it is, but it was not considered cruelty by the people who believed it. It was considered love. The most important thing a parent could do for a child was save their soul. And so the bedtime prayer was not an optional, sweet tucking-in ritual. It was spiritual armor. The prayer that generations of colonial children were taught to say before sleep went like this: "Now I lay me down to sleep, I pray the Lord my soul to keep. If I should die before I wake, I pray the Lord my soul to take." Read that line again. If I should die before I wake. This prayer appeared in the New England Primer, the most widely used textbook in colonial America, with an estimated 6 to 8 million copies sold by 1830, alongside alphabetical rhyming couplets that included lines like, "Though I am young, yet I may die and hasten to eternity." The primer also contained in some editions a woodcut illustration of a man being burned alive at the stake, meant as an example of religious martyrdom for children to contemplate. We have softened bedtime considerably since then, but let me be careful here not to make this into something it was not. Colonial parents were not trying to terrify their children into submission, or at least not most of them, not most of the time. They were doing something more complicated than that. They were preparing their children for a reality that was genuinely frightening, because the reality genuinely was. Cotton Mather, the prominent Puritan minister in Boston, had 15 children. 8 of them died before being weaned. He wrote in his diary, "We have our children taken from us, the desire of our eyes taken away with a stroke." In some communities during this period, 30% of recorded children died before their 5th birthday. Funerals and wakes for children were held in the same rooms where those children had recently played. Older siblings watched younger siblings die. Children in colonial New England did not need to be told that death was possible before morning. They had already seen it. The prayer, "If I should die before I wake," was not designed to frighten. It was designed to comfort, to give a child a framework for that possibility. To say if the worst happens tonight, your soul is held. You're not alone in the dark. That is a genuinely tender thing, even inside a theology we may find difficult. Now, alongside the religious, there was the folkloric. And this is where the colonial children's evening gets interesting in a different way entirely. The 1700s were not a period of confident rationalism for most ordinary people. The Enlightenment was occurring. Philosophers in Europe were busy overturning centuries of received wisdom about the natural world, but those ideas travelled slowly to the farms and villages of colonial America, and when they arrived, they sat uneasily alongside beliefs that had been inherited from England, from Scotland, from the Protestant traditions of Northern Europe, and from the indigenous knowledge that colonists had absorbed consciously, or not, from the land they now inhabited, which is to say, people genuinely believed in things, not metaphorically, not as cultural shorthand. They believed in the possibility of spirits, of providential signs, of creatures that moved through the dark in ways that could not be explained by ordinary causes. The historian David Hall, who studied the mental world of ordinary New Englanders in this period, described their universe as saturated with what he called wonders, events that broke the expected order of nature and demanded a supernatural explanation. Comets, unexplained deaths, strange sounds in the night, animals behaving oddly, a fire that went out without reason. In 1684, the Reverend Increase Mather of Boston published a book called An Essay for the Recording of Illustrious Providences, which collected dozens of documented accounts of supernatural occurrences, apparitions seen by reliable witnesses, strange providential deliverances, voices in the dark houses disturbed by unseen forces. This was not a book of entertainment. It was a book of theology. The supernatural was expected. The only question was what it meant. In this world, what did a colonial child hear from the adults around them about the night? They heard that the forest beyond the cleared land was genuinely dangerous, not just in the practical sense of wolves and cold, but in the older sense, that things moved in it after dark that had no names in any Christian language. The wilderness was not romantic in the 1700s. It was the opposite of civilization, the opposite of order, and for many colonial families it was also the place where the devil was believed to have particular purchase. They heard stories of apparitions seen by neighbours, of a woman in the next town who woke to find a figure standing at the foot of her bed, of strange lights in the marsh that followed travellers and could not be explained. These were not idle entertainments. They were news. They were reports of a world in which the boundary between the natural and the supernatural was permeable, and the night was when that boundary grew thinnest. And then there was the question of what exactly the bedtime stories of this period sounded like. We tend to assume that bedtime stories have always been gentle scaled down for children, stripped of violence, ending with reassurance. This is a very recent invention. The formal genre of the gentle bedtime story with its soothing rhythms and safe resolutions did not develop until the late 19th century. The term bedtime story itself was not coined until 1873. Before that, for the entirety of the colonial period and beyond, what children heard at night were the same stories that adults told each other. Folk tales in the older tradition. Stories that did not sanitize death, did not guarantee happy endings, and did not protect the child from the knowledge that the world was dangerous. Stories where children wandered into forests and did not always come back, where bargains with strangers carried consequences that lasted generations, where the lesson was not everything will be fine, but pay attention because the world has edges and some of them are very sharp. I want to be honest that I find something valuable in this. something that our contemporary gentleness has perhaps lost. There is an argument made by thinkers as different from each other as Bruno Bettelheim in the 20th century, and the folk tradition itself over centuries that children need stories with real darkness in them, that the pretense that nothing bad can happen does not prepare a child for a world where bad things do happen. That facing the shadow in story form, naming it, walking toward it, surviving it, is one of the ways that children learn to be brave. The colonial child who said, "If I should die before I wake," and then closed their eyes and slept, was not a traumatized child. They were a child who'd been told the truth and given a way to hold it. Whether we agree with the theology or not, there is something in that transaction worth thinking about. Here is a question for you, and I mean it genuinely. When you were a child, or when you watch children now, what is the fear that refuses to go away at bedtime? Not the story fear, the real one. The fear underneath. For most children in most times and places, it seems to be some version of the same thing. Not death exactly, but separateness. The moment when the adult leaves the room and closes the door, and the child is alone with the dark, and there is no guarantee of what the dark contains. Colonial children had that fear too. But they also had something that many modern children lack: a cosmology that explained the dark, gave it a name, and placed a guardian in it. Not a nightlight, not a monitor, a God who held your soul even while you slept, and a community that had agreed on what the dark meant and how to face it. Whether that cosmology was true or not is a question I'm not here to answer, but I do not think it was nothing, and I do not think the loss of it has been entirely cost-free. By the time a colonial child in a New England household finally fell asleep, prayers said the catechism recited the last embers of the fire, casting orange shapes across the ceiling. They were sleeping in a room that most modern people would find startling. Not because of the dark exactly, not because of the cold, though, that was real and we will come to it, but because of who else was in that room, and who was in the bed beside them, the sleeping arrangements of a 1700s colonial home who slept where how many people shared a bed, and what the history of the bedroom actually looked like, shocked the first modern historians who looked carefully at the records. And it will probably surprise you too. That is the next story. At the end of the last story, we left a colonial child finally asleep, prayers finished, the catechism recited the last embers of the fire, casting orange shapes across the ceiling before fading to dark. We said that child was sleeping in a room that most modern people would find startling. Not because of the dark, though, that was absolute in a way we can barely picture. Not because of the cold, though we will come to that too. But because of who else was in that room, and who was in the bed beside them. So tonight we step inside, all the way inside the colonial bedroom, and I want to warn you gently that by the end of this story, something you have probably never thought twice about your own bed, your own room, the quiet assumption that sleep is a private thing will look entirely different to you. Let us begin with a question that sounds simple and turns out not to be at all. How many beds did an ordinary colonial family own? If you had asked a colonial housewife in Pennsylvania in 1750 whether she felt her family was reasonably well provided for, and she had smiled and said yes, what would that answer actually mean in terms of what her household contained? For most of us today, the question barely registers. Every person in a household has a bed. Every child has their own room, or is at least supposed to. That assumption is so deep in the way we think about home and comfort and basic dignity that we do not even notice it as an assumption. It is simply how things are. In the 1700s it was not how things were, not even close. The historian Benjamin Rees, after years of studying the history of sleep in Western culture, arrived at a statement I find genuinely arresting. Sleep in a bed in a sealed-off private space alone, or with at most one other person. Not one of those features was consistently in place anywhere in Europe or North America before around 1800. Not one. Your private bedroom, the room you take entirely for granted, the space you consider your most personal refuge, is a recent invention. And the bedroom of an ordinary colonial family in the 1700s was something so different from what we now expect that when historians first began reading the estate inventories and probate records that describe those rooms in detail, some of them apparently had to read the documents twice, because what they found was not what they were looking for. Start with the bed itself, because this is where the story begins, and where the most significant misunderstandings live. In a prosperous colonial household, the finest bed was not tucked away in a quiet back room. It was displayed. The best families in New England, and this pattern held across the colonies, entertained guests in the parlour, and in that parlour, set where every visitor would see it, sat the household's most valuable possession, the great bed fully dressed in its curtains and hangings, bolsters arranged just so, coverlets spread smooth, a physical declaration of the family's standing in the world. Beds were so valuable that they were mentioned by name in wills. They were passed from parents to children as inheritance. A fully dressed four-poster bed with curtains and proper bedding could represent fully half the total value of everything a non-elite colonial family owned. In 1640, a Massachusetts man named William Southmead had a house valued at £8. His feather bed bedstead and bedding were valued at £8 as well. His bed was worth as much as his house. Let that sit for a moment. The colonial bed was not just a place to sleep. It was a financial investment, a status object, a family heirloom, and in many households the most complex piece of equipment in the room. The wooden bedstead had a base of interwoven ropes or leather lacing stretched taut between the rails, which provided the platform for the mattresses, and there were multiple mattresses layered in a specific order. At the bottom, a firm tick stuffed with corn husks, straw, or horsehair. On top of that, the feather bed itself, dense, enveloping, packed with an estimated 90 pounds of goose or duck feathers, heavy in a way that pressed back against you like warmth itself, then bolsters and pillows. The whole structure was nothing like our modern beds. It was closer to being folded inside something warm. Those ropes on the bedstead loosened over time and needed periodic retightening to prevent sagging, which is incidentally the origin of the old bedtime phrase "sleep tight." Now, who slept where? In a typical colonial farmhouse, the parents occupied the best bed. That was fixed and non-negotiable, as natural and unquestioned as the father sitting at the head of the table. Tucked beneath the parents' bedstead on a low wooden frame fitted with small wooden wheels so it could be rolled out at night and rolled back under. During the day slept the youngest children on what were called the trundle bed. When a new baby arrived, the toddler in the trundle graduated to sleeping alongside an older sibling, and the older children wherever they fit, in the loft above the main room if the house had one. On a flock bed, a coarse linen sack filled with rags and straw placed directly on the floor in the corner of the hall. On a settle bench near the hearth that folded flat into a sleeping surface at night. Wherever there was space, because space was the variable that governed everything. In a modest farmhouse of 20 by 20 feet, roughly the size of a large modern living room, 8 or 10 people might sleep. The room did not transform at night into a bedroom. It was still the same room where they had cooked and eaten and worked. The bed was simply the piece of furniture that converted it into sleeping space after the candles were extinguished. Servants, if the household had them, slept in the least comfortable positions. The house offered attic cavities in New England hallways in warmer regions, occasionally at the foot of the master's own bed in the custom inherited from England. Their bedding was the thinnest and least insulating. In unfinished attic spaces in Massachusetts and New Hampshire, through winters of bitter, sustained cold, servants slept with whatever covering they had been given and nothing more. The hierarchy of the household, which we saw so clearly at the dinner table, simply continued into the dark hours without interruption. And then there is the matter of strangers. This is the part that I find genuinely startling, and I think you will too. In colonial America, sharing a bed with a person you'd never met before was entirely normal. Not just tolerated, socially expected and positively understood as part of the ordinary duty of hospitality. Inns along travel routes regularly put 2, 3 or more guests into the same bed as a matter of course. In rural areas, travellers who arrived late at a farmhouse and were offered a place to sleep would commonly find that the available space was a portion of a bed already occupied by someone else. Refusing or expressing displeasure was considered, in the language of the period, obnoxious and unreasonably fastidious. Etiquette guides of the era offered actual instruction on how to share a bed graciously with an unfamiliar person. Lie still. Keep to your own side, do not hog the blankets. These were the manners of a world in which sleeping in proximity to strangers was simply part of what it meant to travel. In September of 1776, John Adams and Benjamin Franklin found themselves sharing a bed at a New Jersey inn. The account of that night has survived in Adams's diary, and it is exactly as amusing as you might hope. Adams wanted the window closed against the night air. Franklin, who held strong and extensively developed theories about fresh air and ventilation, wanted it open and apparently continued to lecture Adams on the subject at some length while they lay there in the dark together. Adams eventually surrendered, the window stayed open, and he fell asleep presumably mid-lecture. 2 of the men who had just signed the Declaration of Independence, sharing a bed, arguing about a window. History is genuinely wonderful sometimes. Now I want to talk about bundling, because it may be the most remarkable sleeping custom of colonial America, and almost certainly the most misunderstood one. Bundling was a practice of supervised courtship that was especially common in Dutch and Welsh immigrant communities, and spread through much of the northeastern colonies. When a young man came to call on a young woman he was courting, he might, with the full knowledge and consent of her parents, be permitted to spend the night in bed beside her. Fully clothed, wrapped in their own separate blankets, sometimes with a long wooden board placed lengthwise between their bodies, the bundling board, to prevent contact. Sometimes the young woman was sewn into a bundling bag, a close-fitted cloth sheath covering her from waist to feet. The logic was entirely practical. A young man might have travelled several hours on foot or horseback to make his visit. The evening was short, candles were rationed, and travelling home in complete winter darkness was genuinely dangerous. It was far more sensible to let him stay, and the supervised setting of the family home parents in the same room or the next one alert to any sound was considered considerably safer than the alternative of the young couple disappearing outdoors alone. The parents, one account recorded with wonderful understatement, kept a watchful eye on them off and on throughout the night. Ministers like Jonathan Edwards condemned bundling vigorously from their pulpits. Moralists wrote pamphlets, and the evidence in the church records of communities where bundling was practiced suggests with some delicacy that the bundling board's effectiveness as a deterrent was not always what its proponents claimed. The rate of premarital pregnancy in these communities was noticeably elevated. History raises an eyebrow. History does not claim to be surprised. I want to pause here and ask you something honestly. What do we lose when we sleep alone? I do not mean romantically. I mean in the purely human sense. For almost all of recorded history, sleep was a social act. People fell asleep within earshot of others. They woke in the presence of others. The last sensory experience before unconsciousness was not silence and isolation, but the sound of someone else breathing the small warmth of shared body heat, the knowledge that you were not alone in the dark. There is research that suggests this communal pattern-shaped sleep itself. Historians and sleep scientists studying pre-industrial communities have found evidence that people in those eras typically slept in 2 distinct phases, separated by 1 to 2 hours of quiet wakefulness in the middle of the night, a period they called the watch or the first waking. During this wakefulness, people might lie still and think, say a quiet prayer, speak softly with whoever was beside them, or simply rest in a state between sleep and full consciousness. The single solid 8-hour block we now call normal sleep appears to be in significant part a product of the industrial age and its need for synchronized labor schedules. The older rhythm of the body was something softer and more broken. I am not proposing we go back to sharing beds with strangers. That particular chapter seems genuinely closed, but I do think there is something worth noticing in the fact that our ancestors fell asleep every night with other humans close by, and that the sealed-off private silent bedroom we have built around ourselves is not an ancient or inevitable arrangement. It is a choice our world made recently and deliberately, and it is worth at least knowing that it was a choice. By the time the colonial household had fully settled into its nighttime configuration, parents in the great bed, smallest children on the trundle, rolled out beside them, older children in the loft, servants in the attic. The house had gone as quiet as it was going to get, which in truth was not very quiet. The rope bed creaked when someone turned. The cornhusk mattress crinkled at every shift of weight. Someone coughed. A child murmured in sleep. The fire popped once in the dark. And before any of that, before the candles were extinguished and the household arranged itself for sleep, there had been something else happening in that small room for the 2 or 3 hours between supper and bedtime. Something that I think will genuinely surprise you, because the popular image of colonial evenings as solemn and joyless gets this particular part almost completely wrong. Because these people got bored, they got restless. They told jokes, they argued about things, they played card games that alarmed the clergy, and they made something out of their evenings that was richer and more varied and more human than the grim Puritan silence we tend to imagine. What an ordinary colonial family actually did in those hours before sleep, before radio, before television, before anything we would recognize as entertainment is the story waiting for you next. Something I want you to try just for a moment. Put down your phone, turn off the screen, sit in whatever room you are in right now and let the silence settle. Not the silence of a muted notification or a paused video, actual silence, or as close to it as you can find in the modern world. How long can you stay with it? For most of us, the honest answer is not very long. We have been conditioned by decades of on-demand entertainment by the ability to summon any song, any show, any distraction within 3 seconds to find genuine, unstructured quiet, almost physically uncomfortable. The empty evening, the evening with no plan and no screen, feels like something that needs to be fixed. Now hold that feeling, because it is the exact feeling that an ordinary colonial family in the 1700s did not have, not because they were more patient or more virtuous than we are, but because they had never experienced anything different. The evening had always been what it was: a few hours of firelight, the people in your house, and whatever you could make of it together. And what they made of it, it turns out, was quite a lot. Let us be precise about something first, because there is a version of colonial American evening that gets romanticized into something it was not. The version where everyone gathers by the fire in gentle, contemplative silence, weaving their thoughts like philosophers. That is not quite right. These were people. They got bored, they got restless. They argued, they gossiped. They told jokes that we would not find particularly funny, and they played games with an enthusiasm that occasionally alarmed the clergy. The Puritans of early New England had tried with limited success to prohibit dice games, card games, and various other amusements they considered contrary to godly living. By the early 1700s, those prohibitions had largely collapsed under the weight of human nature. By mid-century, the young Boston lawyer John Adams grumbled in his diary about the colonial fondness for entertainment. Let others waste their bloom of life at the card or billiards table among rakes and fools. And then one suspects went home and played cards. What did an ordinary colonial family actually do in the hours between supper and sleep? If you had books, and by the mid-1700s a meaningful number of colonial households, did you read them? Reading aloud was the normal mode for evening literary consumption, and this is a difference so fundamental from our experience that it deserved a moment's consideration. We read privately, silently inside our own heads, each person in their own bubble of text. In the colonial household, reading was more often a shared activity. One person read aloud while the others listened or mended or spun or simply sat. The book was a social event. But what books? Here the picture is more varied than the popular image of Puritans huddled grimly over scripture, though scripture was certainly present. By the mid-1700s, the appetite for what the colonial Williamsburg records describe as novels and other books for light diversion was growing at every level of colonial society. Historian Lorena Walsh documented that by 1750, households across the full range of wealth in the Tidewater Chesapeake region were purchasing non-essential consumer goods they had previously considered unimportant, and books for entertainment were among them. Simple broadsides, single sheets printed on one side and sold for a penny, had been circulating since the late 1600s and served as the newspaper, the gossip column, and the pop culture of their age. And then there was the almanac. Poor Richard's Almanac, published annually by Benjamin Franklin beginning in 1732, was perhaps the most widely read secular publication in colonial America. It contained weather predictions, astronomical observations, planting calendars, household advice, and woven throughout the aphorisms and observations that Franklin wrote in the voice of the fictional Richard Saunders. Early to bed and early to rise makes a man healthy, wealthy, and wise. 3 may keep a secret if 2 of them are dead. Well done is better than well said. These were not just famous sayings. They were the conversational currency of the evening, the things people quoted to each other, argued about, used as the starting point for discussion. In a world without broadcast media, a popular almanac functioned something like a shared cultural text that an entire community was reading and talking about simultaneously. Music was everywhere, and it was live because there was no other kind. In wealthier households, a harpsichord or a parlour organ represented a genuine investment, both of money and of the years of practice required to play it competently. Girls of good families were routinely taught to play keyboard instruments not as a hobby, but as an accomplishment that signalled their social formation, their discipline, their readiness for marriage. The sound of a daughter practicing scales in the evening was a kind of household productivity, even if it did not appear on any ledger. But music was not confined to the wealthy. The fiddle, the violin, in its more informal mode, was the instrument of ordinary colonial America, present in taverns and farmhouses and gathering places at every level of society. It was cheap enough to own, portable enough to carry, and versatile enough to play everything from a psalm tune to a reel. Estate inventories from the period document fiddles appearing in households that could afford almost nothing else of luxury. The Reverend Peter Thatcher of Milton, Massachusetts, noted in his diary for December 1681 that, after a work party at his house, 11 men who had spent the day cutting firewood, he made supper for them and then brought out the viol for evening entertainment. Labour became celebration simply by the addition of music. In the southern colonies, where the Puritan suspicion of dancing had never taken hold as deeply, the fiddle was almost synonymous with the evening gathering itself. William Byrd II, the Virginia planter, whose secret diary offers perhaps the most detailed day-by-day record of colonial gentry life we possess, wrote in one entry of giving his enslaved workers a bowl of punch in the evening, after which they had a fiddle and danced. The fiddle appears throughout his diary as the instrument of evening's end, the signal that the work of the day was finished and the social hour had begun. Card games deserve more credit than they typically receive in histories of colonial America because they were genuinely popular across every class and every region, despite the best efforts of certain ministers to stamp them out. Whist was perhaps the most fashionable card game of the 1700s, a trick-taking game requiring partnership and strategy that was widely played in England and spread quickly through the colonies. It was the kind of game you could play for an entire evening with minimal equipment and considerable mental engagement. A card table, 4 players, and a single deck that was the whole apparatus. For those of more modest means, simpler games served just as well. But an early form of poker was reportedly popular among the labouring classes. Cribbage boards appeared in estate inventories across the colonial record, and for those who disapproved of playing cards on moral grounds, and there were plenty dice games offered a slightly more defensible alternative, though not by much in the eyes of the stricter clergy. The game of goose, which colonial Williamsburg records describe as basically a broadside printed with a circular track over which players raced through hazards, guided by throws of the dice, was one of the most affordable parlour entertainments available. It cost about as much as a penny broadside. It could be played by any number of people, and it required no particular skill, which made it the sort of game that worked equally well for children and adults in the same room. Blindman's Buff was played by adults as enthusiastically as by children. Backgammon boards were fashionable among those who could afford the equipment. In the taverns that dotted every colonial town by 1761, John Adams observed that in most New England country towns you could find almost every other house with a sign of entertainment before it. Billiards and bowling contests gave ordinary men a social life that extended beyond the household. Conversation, though, was the great entertainment of the age, and I mean this not as a consolation prize, not as, well, they didn't have television, so they talked instead. I mean it as a genuine form of art that people in the 1700s took seriously in a way that we have largely stopped doing. The conversation of a cultivated colonial household was not small talk. It was practice deliberate, shaped by reading and observation, and the knowledge that the people in your immediate circle were your primary intellectual resource. There were no podcasts explaining the news to you. There were no think pieces offering pre-digested opinions on the events of the week. You formed your views in conversation, tested them against other people's arguments, revised them, or held them in the heat of an actual debate. John Adams's diary entries from the 1750s and 1760s describe evenings spent with friends that extended for hours, not drinking, not gaming, but simply talking. About law, about philosophy, about the nature of government and the rights of men, about what England owed the colonies and what the colonies owed each other. The American Revolution, in one very real sense, was talked into existence in evenings like these in farmhouses and tavern rooms, and drawing rooms by candlelight by people who had nothing to do after supper except think together. Benjamin Franklin understood this better than almost anyone. His Junto Club, founded in Philadelphia in 1727, was a weekly gathering of 12 tradesmen and artisans, not wealthy, not educated at university, not famous, who met on Friday evenings to share books, debate questions of morality and politics, and practice the art of discussion, according to rules Franklin himself devised. Members were required to bring a question to each meeting. They were prohibited from speaking with heat or fondness in defense of their own opinions. The goal was not to win, but to understand. The junto met more or less continuously for 38 years. That is 38 years of Friday evenings by candlelight talking. There is something here worth naming, and I want to say it carefully because I am not interested in the simple nostalgic version, the version that says the past was better and leaves it at that. I do not think the past was better. I think it was harder in most of the ways that matter. The colonial evening had genuine pleasures, but it also had cold and illness and boredom and all the ordinary frictions of people who could not get away from each other, because there was literally nowhere to go. But I do think there is something worth asking. When we gained the ability to fill every silent moment with content, when the screen became available for every train ride and every waiting room and every quiet 10 minutes before sleep, what did we lose in the exchange? What kind of attention? What kind of conversation? What kind of thinking is only possible when the evening has no programming? Do you have a friend you have not really talked to in months? Genuinely talked? The way the Junto members talked, because every time you are together you are also looking at your phones. I ask this not to make you feel guilty. I ask it because I think it is an honest question that the colonial evening puts to ours. The fiddle put away, the cards laid down, the candle trimmed one last time. And before the household went to bed, there was one more thing that almost every colonial family did regardless of wealth or region or denomination. They prepared for what might happen in the night. Because in a world without modern medicine, without hospitals, without the certainty that tomorrow morning everyone would wake healthy, the possibility of illness after dark was not theoretical. It was part of the evening. And the story of what happened when someone got sick at night in the 1700s is one of the most unsettling, most tender, and most revealing chapters in the life of these homes. Picture this. It is past midnight. The fire has burned low. The house is quiet, the children are asleep, and you're finally drifting toward rest after a day that started before sunrise and ended long after dark. And then a sound. A cough. Not an ordinary cough. The kind of cough that has something different in it. Something wet and persistent, the kind that makes a parent's stomach drop before the mind has even fully woken. You lie still for 1 second, 2 seconds, listening, hoping it will stop. It does not stop. You get up. Now here is the question I want you to hold for the next several minutes. What do you do next? In our world, the answer involves a thermometer, a phone, a 24-hour pharmacy, and if things get serious enough, an emergency room staffed by people who went to medical school for a decade. The infrastructure of modern illness response is so deeply woven into our lives that we barely think of it as infrastructure at all. It is simply what you do. In the 1700s, none of that existed. Not a single piece of it. What happened when someone got sick at night in a colonial home was a story of remarkable improvisation, genuine love, and a medicine cabinet that by our standards was somewhere between useless and actively dangerous. And understanding how those families faced illness in the dark tells you something essential about how they understood life itself. The first thing you need to know is how many physicians were actually available in colonial America, because the number is almost comically small by modern standards. One historian studying the 1770s estimated that across all of the American colonies combined a territory the size of Western Europe, with a population of roughly 2.5 million people, there were only about 200 physicians who held actual medical degrees. 200. These doctors had typically studied in Edinburgh or London because there were no medical schools in the colonies at all until 1765, when the first one opened in Philadelphia. Before that, the vast majority of people who called themselves doctors had learned through apprenticeship, watching a more experienced practitioner for a few years and then going out on their own. The knowledge they carried was a mixture of genuine observation, inherited wisdom, and some theories that we would now politely describe as mistaken. The cost of summoning even this imperfect help was also significant. Doctors' fees were not trivial for ordinary families. Travel roads were poor, and a doctor who lived 10 miles away in the rain and cold of a winter night was for all practical purposes as unreachable as a doctor on the other side of the ocean. The reality of rural colonial medicine was this: most families most of the time took care of their sick entirely on their own. So who exactly was the medical authority inside the colonial household the mother? Not by formal training, not by any credential anyone would recognize today, but by accumulated knowledge passed down through generations of women who had watched each other manage illness, who'd kept notes and recipes in the back pages of their household books, who had grown and dried and stored the herbs that formed the colonial medicine cabinet. Published housekeeping guides of the period routinely included detailed instructions in medical care alongside recipes for bread and preserves, because the line between cooking and healing was not clearly drawn. The woman who knew how to make a poultice was the same woman who knew how to make supper. One of the most widely circulated books in colonial Virginia was a guidebook called Every Man His Own Doctor, with the clarifying subtitle, The Poor Planter's Physician. Its premise was stated plainly in its introduction. It contained plain and easy means for persons to cure themselves of all or most of the ailments common to their climate, using medicines chiefly of the growth and production of that country. The book went through multiple editions and was read by candlelight in farmhouses across the colonies by women who were quite literally the only medical resource available to their families at 2 a.m. Another highly respected text was William Buchan's Domestic Medicine, first published in Edinburgh in 1769 and quickly reprinted in the American colonies. Buchan was unusual for his time in arguing for relatively gentle treatments, rest clean water, fresh air at a moment when most of his medical contemporaries believed that medicine should produce dramatic and violent reactions in the body to prove it was working. His book sold tens of thousands of copies in the colonies and became for many families the closest thing they had to a family doctor between visits. Betty Washington. Lewis, the sister of George Washington, owned a copy of Eliza Smith's 1739 cookbook, The Complete Housewife, which alongside its food recipes contained explicit medicinal instructions for treating conditions ranging from an upset stomach to something the author called a cancerous breast, to preparations described as for preserving the lungs. These were not exotic specialty items, they were in a cookbook, because that is where medicine lived. When fever arrived in the night, and fever was the great terror, the symptom that preceded so many of the colonial era's most deadly diseases, the response followed a fairly consistent sequence that mixed genuine care with treatments we now know did more harm than good. The herbs came first: lavender, rosemary, sage, mint, wormwood, chamomile. These were not decorative garden plants, they were medical supplies. Every man his own doctor prescribed that for fevers the patient should drink freely of water, gruel orange whey or weak chamomile tea. If the patient's spirits were low, small wine whey sharpened with lemon juice was recommended. This is not entirely without merit. Chamomile does have mild calming properties, and encouraging a feverish person to drink fluids was actually sound advice. The colonial herb garden in this respect was sometimes surprisingly effective. The bloodletting, however, was not. By the 1700s, the practice of deliberately cutting a vein or applying leeches to draw out blood had been a cornerstone of Western medicine for more than 2,000 years, and it remained firmly in place because it appeared to work. Fevers sometimes subsided after bloodletting. The patient sometimes reported feeling better. What no one yet understood germ theory would not arrive for another century and a half was that these improvements occurred despite the bloodletting, not because of it. The underlying belief was that illness resulted from an imbalance of the 4 humours in the body: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, black bile, and that drawing off the excess would restore balance. The treatment sometimes weakened patients so severely that they could not recover from the illness that had prompted it in the first place. There is a grim irony in the fact that bloodletting almost certainly contributed to the death of George Washington himself in 1799, when his physicians removed roughly 40% of his total blood volume over the course of one day in an attempt to treat what was likely a bacterial throat infection. For childhood fevers in particular, the stakes were almost unbearably high. The diphtheria epidemic that swept through New England in 1735 and 1736 killed more than 1,000 children in New Hampshire alone, in a colony of only 23,000 people. 90% of the deaths were children under the age of 10. Noah Webster, the lexicographer and chronicler of American life, called diphtheria the plague among children. Some families lost half of all their children in a single outbreak. The parents sitting up through the night with a feverish child were not being overly anxious. They are making a calculation every hour about whether this was the ordinary fever that passed or the one that did not. Here is what strikes me most about all of this, and I want to be honest about where my own feelings are. Reading the diaries and household records of colonial women managing illness at night, the accounts of mothers who sat up until dawn counting breaths, who applied warm cloths and burned herbs and prayed and calculated and worried, I do not feel pity for them exactly. What I feel is something closer to awe. Not because their medicine was good, it wasn't. Not because their situation was acceptable, it was terrifying. But because of what they brought to it, the fullness of their attention, the depth of their care, and the complete absence of the thing that we sometimes use to substitute for both of those the feeling that we have handed the problem off to a system. When a modern parent calls the pediatric nurse line at 3 a.m, there is enormous relief in hearing a professional voice. That relief is real, and the medicine behind it is genuinely life-saving, and I would not trade it for anything. But there is something that occasionally gets lost in the quality of presence that happens when you are the only resource your child has, when there is no one to call, when the warm cloth on the forehead is the entirety of what medicine looks like. Have you ever sat up all night with someone you loved who was sick? Not in a hospital waiting room, but at home in the particular darkness of 3 a.m, doing the small things you could do and feeling the limits of what those were. If you have, then you have some faint echo of what this was like every time for every parent in every colonial household that winter touched. There is one more dimension to illness in the 1700s that does not translate easily into modern understanding, and it is this: the sick person almost never left the house. There were no hospitals for ordinary people in colonial America in any meaningful sense. Pennsylvania Hospital, founded in Philadelphia in 1751 by Benjamin Franklin, and the physician Thomas Bond was one of the very first in the colonies, and it served primarily the poor of the city. For the vast majority of sick people throughout the colonial period, illness happened at home, was treated at home, and ended in either direction at home. The sick room was a domestic space. The person tending it was a family member. The smells, the sounds, the unbroken intimacy of that vigil, all of it took place inside the walls of the ordinary home. What this meant, among other things, was that death was also a domestic experience in a way it has almost entirely ceased to be in the modern world. When someone in a colonial household died, they died in the room where they had slept and lived and eaten. The family was present. The children were often present. There was no quiet removal to an institution, no gentle separation from the ending of a life. It was simply there in the house, a fact that everyone witnessed together. I don't say this to be sorrowful. I say it because it shaped in profound ways how those families thought about every ordinary evening, including the ones that ended well. The awareness that illness could arrive at any hour without warning, that the night held no professional safety net, that the people you loved were entirely in your care, this awareness gave the colonial evening a texture that I think we struggle to imagine. It made the healthy evenings feel different. The card game, the fiddle, the reading aloud by candlelight, these happened against a background that we've been able to mostly remove from our peripheral vision. They could not remove it, and perhaps because they could not, they did not take quite as much for granted. The herbs are put away now. The chamomile tea has gone cold. The fire needs tending one more time before the household can finally fully rest. And it is in those last quiet minutes before sleep, when the sick have been settled, when the fear has subsided or is being held at bay, that the colonial family turn to something that had been with them all evening, threading through every moment of the day without ever quite being named. Their prayers, their rituals, the particular spiritual life of a 1700s evening, and what it actually looked like when a family prepared their souls for the night ahead. That conversation is next. We've spent a long time inside this house together. We have watched the last light of sunset arrive like a quiet emergency. We sat by the fire and learned that the hearth was not decoration. It was survival. We saw what they ate, how they sat at that table, who was permitted to speak and who was not. We held a candle and really understood for the first time what 1 hour of light cost. We followed the mother into the long dark of her evening labour. We put the children to bed with a prayer that acknowledged gently and unflinchingly that they might not wake. We played cards and listened to the fiddle. We sat up through the night with someone who was sick, armed with chamomile tea and a well-worn book of remedies, and tried to love our way through what medicine could not fix. Now we arrive at the last hour, the hour that comes after everything else has been done, when the candle has been burned as low as it can go and still be useful, when the house is finally actually quiet. What happened in that last hour in a 1700s home is something that most modern people, if they encountered it directly, would find either deeply moving or deeply foreign, and possibly both at once. Let us start with something that might surprise you. The single candle was often deliberately extinguished during the family prayers each evening. This was not poverty in the sense of carelessness. It was intentional. Alice Morse Earle, the historian who spent decades studying colonial domestic life, documented that Puritan ministers who already lived on modest incomes would extinguish the candle during evening prayers rather than let it burn through the recitation. The darkness was not an inconvenience. It was part of the posture. You did not need to see anything to speak honestly with God. The darkness was where honesty lived. What the colonial family brought to their evening prayers was a theological understanding of nighttime that is genuinely difficult to recreate in the modern imagination. For the Puritans of New England and the Anglicans of Virginia alike, going to sleep was not simply a biological necessity. It was a small surrender, a brief death. The body laying down its consciousness, releasing its grip on the day, entering a state that no one fully controlled, and from which return was not technically guaranteed. This is why, as Christian History magazine documented from Puritan devotional sources, the evening prayer was specifically structured around what they called secret exercises, a private interior accounting that happened just before sleep. At night they reviewed the day's behaviour, gave thanks for whatever blessings had arrived, repented of whatever had been said or done that should not have been submitted themselves, anew to the will of God, and deliberately, consciously embraced mortality, not as a morbid exercise, as a preparation. The Puritans had a phrase for this practice, embracing mortality, and what strikes me about it every time I come back to this material is that they were not being theatrical, they were being practical. In a world where the diphtheria epidemic of 1735 could kill 1,000 children in New Hampshire in a single season, in a world where a fever that arrived in the night might be ordinary, or might be the beginning of the end, the possibility that you would not wake up was not a philosophical abstraction. It was a reasonable statistical concern. Preparing yourself for it was simply good sense. The structure of evening devotions varied by region and denomination, but the shape was recognizable across the colonial world. In the Puritan household of New England, family prayers were a fixed institution, the third of the 3 private exercises that organized the devout colonial day, alongside morning devotion and mealtime blessing. The Bible was read in course, meaning chapter by chapter sequentially through the whole text. Not selected passages chosen for comfort or relevance, the whole thing from beginning to end in order. A psalm was sung. Prayers were offered not from a prayer book, but extemporaneously in the Father's own words, which was itself a skill that colonial men worked to cultivate, because the quality of one's family prayers was a matter of genuine social standing in the community. Cotton Mather, the Boston minister whose diaries are among the most intimate records of Puritan domestic life, wrote movingly about kneeling with his daughter Katie at the end of one evening's private conference between them. He had led her through a spiritual conversation about her soul, and then he wrote, "I thereupon made the child kneel down by me, and I poured out my cries unto the Lord that he would lay his hands upon her, and bless her, and save her, and make her a temple of his glory. It will be so, it will be so." The repetition of that last phrase, "it will be so," is one of the most quietly heartbreaking things in the colonial record. Here is a man who knew, as every colonial parent knew, that the child kneeling beside him might not survive to adulthood, whose own 14 children had not all survived, and who chose in that knowledge not despair, but insistence. Not certainty, he did not have certainty, but determination. A refusal to stop hoping out loud, even in the dark, even at the end of the day, even knowing what he knew. In the Anglican households of Virginia and the southern colonies, the texture was different, but the gesture was the same. The Book of Common Prayer, that great inheritance of the English Reformation, contained specific forms for evening prayer known as evensong, that structured the end of the day for Anglican families across the colonial world. Its language moved between acknowledgement of failure and affirmation of grace in a rhythm that colonists heard so often. It became the grammar of their inner lives. The phrases went into them the way music goes into people, not as doctrine to be debated, but as texture to inhabit. By the mid-1700s across the colonies, the Great Awakening of the 1730s and 1740s had added a new layer to colonial spiritual life. Preachers like George Whitefield and Jonathan Edwards had introduced a more emotionally immediate, personally urgent version of Protestant faith, one that asked not whether you practiced the correct rituals, but whether you had experienced a genuine transformative encounter with God. This shift touched even households that would have called themselves moderate Anglicans or comfortable Congregationalists. By the time the evening prayer was said in a colonial home circa 1750 or 1760, it carried the weight of both the old structured forms and the new evangelical urgency. Two currents running together in the same quiet room. And then the prayers ended. And this is where the colonial night becomes most interesting to me, not in the prayers themselves, which we can reconstruct from the texts, but in what happened after, in the particular quality of silence that followed the last Amen. The candle, if it had not already been extinguished, was snuffed now. The fire, if it was still burning, was left to die down on its own, or banked carefully under the curfew dome, the couvre-feu that we talked about at the beginning of this long evening hours ago. The chamber stick was carried from room to room as the last person to bed made their circuit of the house. What did the colonial night actually sound like? Historian Roger E. Kirch, whose landmark work at Day's Close Night in times past drew on thousands of diaries, letters and personal accounts to reconstruct the pre-industrial experience of darkness, found that colonial people described the night as extraordinarily loud, in ways that modern city dwellers simply do not hear. Not loud with human noise, loud with the world. The wind in the wooden frames of the house, which were not sealed and insulated the way modern houses are, and which spoke with every change in weather. The sound of animals in the barn and in the fields. In New England, the creak of ice forming on a pond. In Virginia, the particular sound of summer insects that colonists from England had never heard before they came to this continent, and found genuinely unsettling at first. the wood of the house itself settling and contracting through the night in response to temperature. And underneath all of it, for those who had ears for it, the sound of other people breathing. This is the detail that I keep coming back to, the detail that I think matters more than any other in understanding the emotional texture of a 1700s evening. In a world where multiple people shared a bed, where children slept alongside parents, where servants sometimes slept in the same room as the family, where the boundaries of sleeping space were entirely different from our own, the last sound you heard before sleep was almost always another person's breath. Not a device, not a program, not a sound that someone else had chosen for you to hear as you drifted off. Another human being present alive nearby. Now I want to say something about what this whole evening has added up to. Not a lesson, I am not interested in lessons, but an observation offered as honestly as I can. We began this evening at sunset watching a colonial family race against the dying light to finish everything the day required. We end it here in the dark, listening to the sound of breathing. In between, we spent time with people who had almost nothing, that we have no electric light, no central heating, no antibiotics, no ambulances, no ability to call anyone. People who extinguished their candles during prayers because candles were too expensive to burn while talking to God. People who sewed by firelight until their eyes gave out and called it a normal evening, and yet something threads through all of these hours that I did not expect when I started thinking about this series, and that I am genuinely not sure how to name. It is not nostalgia, I want to be clear about that. I would not want to live this life. I do not think you would either, and I think anyone who says they would is romanticizing the cold and the fear and the early death. But there is something in the density of these evenings, the way every hour had a purpose, and the purpose was immediate and human. The fire had to be tended or the family would suffer. The prayers had to be said because tomorrow was genuinely uncertain. The breathing you heard in the dark was not background noise, it was the whole point. There is a question buried in all of this that I think belongs to you, not to me. What does your evening look like? Not what do you do with it? I know what you do with it, because I do the same things. But what does it feel like when it ends? When the last screen goes dark and the house goes quiet, is there something there in that quiet? Some small version of what those colonial families touched every night? Or have we built so many layers between ourselves and the dark that we can no longer quite feel it? I don't ask that to make you feel guilty about your phone. I ask it because I think it is the most interesting question the 1700s can put to us. And because the fact that you are here listening to a story about ordinary people in ordinary homes 300 years ago suggests that some part of you already knows the answer. The last candle is out now. The fire is a few slow embers, orange and patient. Outside, the colonial night does what it always does. It gets darker than you can quite believe, darker than any room you have ever been in the stars, visible in a way that residents of modern cities have almost entirely lost the ability to see. Inside the house, one by one, the breathing slows. The day is done. Thank you for spending this evening here. What we covered together was never just a history of houses or routines or old ways of doing things. It was a portrait of what it means to be human when the margins are thin, when the light costs something, when the night is real, when the people you love are the whole radius of your world. If any part of this evening stayed with you, a detail that surprised you, a question that opened rather than closed, I would genuinely love to know which one. Drop it in the comments. Tell me the moment where you thought I did not know that, or I did not expect to feel that way about something so ordinary. Those are the moments I work toward. And if you have come this far with me through all of these evenings and all of these lives, thank you. Truly, it means more than I can easily say. There are more evenings to spend together, more homes, more centuries, more ordinary people, whose names history did not bother to record, but whose lives are worth every minute of attention we can give them. I will see you in the next one. Until then, take care of the people in your house tonight. Light something warm if you can. And when the last screen goes dark, listen just for a moment to the sound of the room around you. It has more in it than you think.